This video is going to be a read aloud for chapters 3 and 4 of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. If you remember, in chapter 2, Utterson was upset at the story that Enfield had told him, and he wanted to figure out who this Mr. Hyde fellow was, and so he went to hang around the doorstep hoping to run into Mr. Hyde. And he did, and he was a very unsettling fellow, and it just made Utterson even more sick that his friend Dr. Jekyll would have some kind of association with Mr. Hyde. He can't figure out why. But also he went to Dr. Lanyon, another friend of his, to see if Lanyon had known anything about this relationship between Jekyll and Hyde, and Lanyon didn't know anything. So that's where we are as we begin chapter 3. This chapter introduces Dr. Jekyll. You know, in the previous chapters, we've already seen a little of Mr. Hyde, and this chapter is going to feature Dr. Jekyll. A fortnight later, by excellent good fortune, the doctor gave one of his pleasant dinners to some 5 or 6 old cronies, all intelligent, reputable men, and all judges of good wine, and Mr. Utterson so contrived that he remained behind after the others had departed. Many people loved to have Mr. Utterson stay at parties after the other light-hearted and loose-tongued party-goers had gone away. Dr. Jekyll was no exception to this rule. And now, sitting opposite in front of the fireplace, a large, well-made, smooth-faced man of 50, with something of a slyish cast, perhaps, but every mark of capacity and kindness. You could see by his look that he cherished for Mr. Utterson a sincere and warm affection. So notice this is our first description of what Dr. Jekyll looks like. "I've been wanting to speak to you, Jekyll," began the latter. "You know that will of yours?" Dr. Jekyll played off his concern at his will being mentioned, and he said, "I never saw a man so distressed as you were by my will, unless it were that hidebound pedant Lanyon at what he called my scientific heresies." "You know I never approved of it," pursued Utterson, and he's talking about the will. "My will? Yes, certainly I know that," said the doctor, a trifle sharply. "You have told me so." "Well, I tell you so again," continued the lawyer. "I've been learning something of young Hyde." Dr. Jekyll's handsome face grew pale, and there came a blackness about his eyes. "What I heard was abominable," said Utterson. Dr. Jekyll assured Utterson that he was quite all right with Hyde, and asked Utterson to please take care of Hyde if something were to happen to the doctor. Utterson unhappily agreed to carry out the will should Dr. Jekyll pass on. Chapter 4, The Carew Murder Case. Nearly a year later, in the month of October, in the year 18, and the author doesn't give us an exact year, London was startled by a crime of singular ferocity. So this is about a year after Dr. Jekyll had a conversation at a party with Mr. Utterson. Okay, 1 year later, there was a crime in October. And here's what happened. A maidservant became aware from her window of an aged and beautiful gentleman with white hair, and a very small gentleman she was surprised to recognize as a certain Mr. Hyde, who had once visited her master, and for whom she had conceived a dislike. Okay, so she's looking out her window and she sees an older gentleman, and she also sees Mr. Hyde. The next moment, with ape-like fury, Hyde was trampling his victim underfoot and hailing down a storm of blows under which the bones were audibly shattered. She called the police. The stick with which the deed had been done had broken in the middle under the stress of this insensate cruelty, and one splintered half had rolled into the neighboring gutter. The other, without doubt, had been carried away by the murderer. A purse and a gold watch were found upon the victim, but no cards or papers, except a sealed and stamped envelope which bore the name and address of Mr. Utterson. Okay? On the old man's body, he still had his purse or his billfold. He had a gold watch, so that means that the murderer did not want to steal anything from him. The only thing that he had that was the only other thing he had was a sealed and stamped envelope that was to be delivered to Mr. Utterson. Okay, he had that on him. Thus, it was Mr. Utterson who had the sad task of identifying the body as that of his client, the Member of Parliament, Sir Danvers Carew. Now, Parliament in London is the same similar parallel to the Senate, the United States Senate. So this man was very important. He was a member of Parliament. Like he was probably, in America, he would be like a senator. So he was an important person, Sir Danvers Carew. He quailed at the name of Hyde, that's Mr. Utterson, and showed his police hosts to the dingy address in Soho, but Hyde was long gone, and the servants tight-lipped. Okay.